Andrea, you're still muted. Sorry for scaring you.
Hey, Elisa, while you're here, could you give me sharing privileges on the Zoom?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Lisa, we're just going to wait for a few minutes to see if anybody else joins us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started on our second deep dive session. I'm going to hand it over to Bartek to start with a presentation. So.
All right, I just have a short presentation tonight. I'm going to focus on three items in the zoning code pertaining to housing, and the top three that's housing choice. Second is the affordable housing requirements, and third is related to short-term rentals. I'll just say nothing that I'm presenting tonight is necessarily new. These are all items that I've discussed with members of the council in the past year and a half. These are items that we've discussed with the public in the past year and a half, and many of these items have changed significantly as a result of community feedback and also just the internal process at City Hall that we took in drafting this code. So this is just a recap slide. But the main point is that we're trying to remove barriers to housing development in the city, and then also administratively make that process a little bit easier. And the main strategy there is we're introducing a new minor site plan review process. So smaller projects would not have to go through the traditional planning board approval. They could be approved administratively within City Hall. And then, of course, there's a host of other barriers and incentives that we're providing in the new zoning code for housing itself. No minimum parking requirements, no maximum number of units for certain building types, allowing accessory dwelling units citywide, then also a host of incentives for affordable housing. I'll go into some of this in a few minutes. All right. So strategy number one is improving housing access. And primarily what we're doing this by, and this is cut off here in the screen I see now, but primarily how we're doing that is allowing missing middle building types throughout Kingston. And this is related to housing choice. So allowing more housing types in the city means that we will have more attainable housing options for more people. So, specifically I'm referring to accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and triplexes. These are types of housing that were once legal to build in many of Kingston's neighborhoods, and in fact, still exist very much so within the city of Kingston. They just haven't been able to be built primarily since the current zoning code was adopted in the 1960s. By encouraging some of these housing types, we're encouraging not only housing diversity, but economic diversity. These housing types historically have been a more attainable housing option to lower and moderate income families. And, with regards to accessory dwelling units in particular, but this is true of many of the missing middle types of housing, the impact of these types of housing within neighborhoods is quite marginal. Accessory dwelling units, for instance, are small. They don't really change the fabric or the look and feel when constructed. I shared this statistic during the public hearing, which is that under the current zoning code, 78% of our residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. Now, why is it important to change this statistic? Again, as I just mentioned, by encouraging housing diversity, we're also encouraging economic diversity. History also shows us that the type of zoning that we have today was quite often used as a method to exclude people of color and low-income households from living in affluent neighborhoods when the civil rights movement outlawed racial covenants. So, our current zoning is in some ways a legacy of that system. And we also know that exclusionary zoning exacerbates the housing crisis that we have today. I just have this list of research listed here. I'm not going to go through this, but there's a broad body of research to support that the current restrictive type of zoning that we have today raises housing costs and contributes to exclusion. And by many measures, New York has some of the most exclusionary zoning in the country, and Kingston is no exception to that. This is there's very broad consensus around this fact. This is just a recent publication from the White House about exclusionary zoning and its effect on racial discrimination in the housing market. And then in terms of allowing missing middle housing and more construction of other housing types, again, there's broad consensus around this. I do just want to point out that AARP is one of the nationally is one of the proponents of this because they recognize that older homeowners who might want to sell their residence and move into something nearby that's more affordable, compact, and accessible, they routinely discover that such housing doesn't exist. Missing housing styles, such as these pictured here, they typically look like and are the size of single-family dwellings. These buildings fit pretty seamlessly into existing neighborhoods. At the same time, these multifamily structures can provide a wide range of housing options at various price points. I do want to address some of the public comments that we have received in relation to this this point. And I do think at the public hearing and also the public comments that the council received and also that we've received throughout this process, most of the city residents that I've talked to do support these changes. But I do just want to address some of the criticism that we have received. So number one, because this is a form-based code, that means that any new development will not be out of scale with what already exists in that neighborhood, right? So that's because for each transect area, we have lot coverage, massing, and height limits that have been established. And Dover Cole, for each transect, specifically tailor them to what already exists in each neighborhood, right? So you're not going to have new development be out of scale with what already exists. Second, evidence from other cities that have adopted zoning reform does suggest that this is a meaningful step towards housing affordability, but it's also highly incremental, meaning that we're unlikely to see a rush of development that's suddenly going to change Kingston. Third, the evidence from other cities strongly suggests that owners of single-family homes will not see their property values fall. This is some pieces of feedback that we have received, but there's no evidence to support it whatsoever. And then, of course, any major site plan will still receive the same careful review from planning and engineering and the various departments within City Hall. Yes. Definitely. Yep. Okay. All right. So this table is unlegible to you, but I'll just go. It is, yes. It's table 40519. I don't have the specific page number, but it's in the affordable housing standards. Yep, that's right. So I'll just briefly review this. So the new code will require 10% affordable housing for projects with 7 or more units. Additionally, there are a number of new provisions in this code compared to the current zoning code. So there's a provision for a bonus height, So you can get an extra story in certain areas of the city if you get to 20% affordability. And then there's a sort of a tiered structure, which as you increase the number of units, there's also a workforce housing requirement. So that's 5% for projects with 20 more units. And then for projects with 50 or more units, it's an additional 10% workforce housing. So for instance, a project with 55 units would have to contain 10% affordable units and 10% workforce housing units. Affordable housing is defined as 80% area and median income. Workforce is 120% area and median income. I'll just say the goal with these standards is to balance a required minimum amount with creating a standard that's actually market feasible, right? That will actually result in housing production. I don't think we want this too high to prevent housing development in the first place, but we certainly want a required minimum amount. I believe these standards achieve that careful balance. And I'll also note that beyond these requirements, there's a host of new incentives in the final draft for affordable housing. That includes a discount on site plan review applications, depending on the amount of affordability included in the project. Okay, and lastly, I just want to address short-term rentals. So we updated these standards significantly in the final draft based on feedback that we received. So the final draft sets a cap on the number of whole unit rentals equal to 1% of the city's housing stock. So currently there's about 10,000 long-term housing units in the city of Kingston. That would equate to about 100 short-term rentals. Additionally, only one short-term rental would be allowed per property. On the whole, this protects 99% of the city's housing stock while allowing a limited amount of short-term rental activity. There's two. We've heard both sides of this conversation throughout this process, but I believe this is a good balance between those two sides. And this is my last slide. It relates to new enforcement actions, which are outside of the zoning code, but I believe are nonetheless important in this conversation. Currently, the Building Safety Department cannot charge penalties for violations of short-term rental provisions. I'm planning on introducing those. I'm planning on proposing to the council that we significantly increase the annual registration fees, which are currently quite low. And then perhaps most importantly, we've already signed a contract with GovOS, which is a short-term rental monitoring and compliance software, which will allow us to ensure that properties that are not in compliance will fall into compliance. And that also introduces an online registration. It's just to make it easier for short-term rentals to register, and I think reduce some of the work that building safety has to do in this aspect. That's all I got. Questions, thoughts? No, go ahead.
So thank you for all of that, and I appreciate the enforcement mechanisms and tools that you presented. I think that it is for anything to work even around the short-term rental enforcement, the building staff is going to need more manpower. The city of Hudson, I know, has hired a zoning enforcement officer just to deal with short-term rentals. So given that so much is going on here and so many changes, and that to really be able to enforce any of this, that is something that's really...
Actually, I meant to say, I asked Steve Knox to come, but he just couldn't make the night. So if
Okay.
there's any questions, I told him I'd gather up some questions so I could ask him like what staff he would need to make something like this work.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think obviously we're not live with GovOS yet, but I do think it will make it a little bit easier, and it'll also allow better cooperation between departments in City Hall, because any department could log in, see who's registered, see who's not, right? See which short-term rentals are operating without a license. So it'll make the process hopefully easier. But yeah, certainly I agree with you, because we're also requiring inspections for each short-term rental, which is labor-intensive.
Would that online platform be able to give us reports and compliance reports that we will be able to see?
Absolutely.
Okay.
N-
Questions or
Sue,
thoughts or
I was just,
just
Sue, do you want to
general-
add anything to my presentation?
No, just a couple of points, though. There are some other like sections that I do think need to be focused on as well. For example, there is in the payment in lieu of section under the affordable housing component, the council has to adopt criteria setting forth the parameters so that can be utilized. And so that's something that the council needs to, I'll think about at the same time as you're looking at this legislation, because the two go hand in hand. So I just wanted to make that point. Other than that, I don't really have anything to add.
Thanks for bringing up the payment in lieu, because that came up in the public hearing as well. Regarding payment in lieu, most mandatory affordable housing requirements in other municipalities include a payment in lieu, because it makes the provisions stronger from a legal perspective. At the same time, we have tried to make the bar as high as possible. So a payment in lieu request would have to be approved by the Common Council. And that's one of the, by design, one of the few places in the zoning code that requires Common Council action, just because we wanted that bar to be high.
Looking at other municipalities who do this, do you know, have you done any research to know if it's typically they go with the affordable housing or they go with the payment in lieu? Do you have enough information on that?
Yeah, so I found that there's mandatory programs and voluntary programs and some research that's been done around it about which is more productive. And so of the country's 20 most productive municipal programs, 12 are mandatory. So there is a bunch of data, and I could send you guys this article. The most productive voluntary programs rely on providing benefits that are extremely desirable or financially necessary. So New York City's 421A.
You mean voluntary, you mean they could choose
Yeah,
this over doing the requirements?
Yeah, either you opt in
Okay.
or it's
So you
just mandatory
sort of
that it
voluntary, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, we have tried to include some carrots and sticks. So there's a mandatory amount, right? But there's also this idea of a density bonus, which is an incentive. So that would be a voluntary provision. Regarding that question, that's very interesting. I've in all the research, I have not seen research on that question specifically. I'm trying to think of recent examples, and I don't have any data on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can send this to you. Is it from Shelter Force?
Okay. But I do think another important conversation is, let's say we do include the payment in lieu provision. What do we do with the payment in lieu? And so the code does include language that would go into a housing trust fund.
That's the plans going into housing trust fund?
That is the language in the zoning code that it would go to a housing trust fund,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
To be established housing trust fund.
So the only thing the council would have to do is the criteria.
That's
So,
right.
and so if we are going further down, you're prepared to share some examples with us, so we'll.
I would propose certain criteria for the
Okay.
council to consider, yeah.
I'm concerned that we are, without having, without putting that aside, getting rid of the payment in lieu, we're just being able to create more units and more neighborhoods. And it's not true inclusionary zoning, because if, even with the affordability factor of the buildings, we're not able to bring in people under an 80% AMI. So it's not truly inclusionary in the way that we're bringing in people into a neighborhood that wouldn't have been able to afford to live there.
So, yeah, one of the balance that I've been trying to achieve is if we make the requirements too all-encompassing, we're not going to get any housing in the first place. And I can tell you, example locally is that we've had our local, we've had inclusionary zoning provisions, and I can count the number of units that's produced on one hand, right? So it hasn't really led to many units. So that's one of the balancing acts here. Another important consideration is that some of the housing types that we're proposing to legalize are just inherently more affordable. And I'm just going to read you this report that I saw from Seattle, which is about the affordability of new ADUs, so new accessory dwelling units. And it found that 8 out of the 10 recently constructed ADUs charged less than the average monthly rent for the city, and more than half of those charged rent that was 75% or less than the average. Right, so they're affordable just by design, without us even having to mandate, right, a certain level of AMI.
Right, no, I agree with you on that, and I especially given, the grant that's come forward, right, to help offset costs, and if they are kept affordable, I think that's great. So, yeah, as far as ADUs, I'm, as I've tried to, have that looked at before, so that I agree on. So, just the only thing I don't agree still is about having short-term rentals, ADUs be used as short-term rentals, and I just because we're in a housing crisis, and I feel like an ADU can be built the most quickly and before we can ever get a building up, right? So to have, maybe in the future that can be reversed once we have more units, but I just see ADUs being units that can go online the most quickly, so.
Does anyone have any other thoughts on that? Michelle and we've talked about this a little bit.
Can you just, I didn't get a chance to review this week, so you can, part of that 1% cap, it could be an ADU, could be short-term.
That's right, yes.
It would still have to go through the permit process.
Right,
and be
if there's the whole unit rentals, short-term rentals, are only allowed in certain transit areas, and there's a 1% cap. So, right, if an ADU was built in an area that allowed short-term rentals and there was room in the cap, then yes, potentially that could be used as a short-term rental.
could we not do that?
I guess that's the debate that we're having right now. Yeah. So-
Because I agree with Michelle, I would like to have ADUs not be short-term rentals.
The reason why we allowed ADUs to be used as short-term rentals is actually due to some public feedback that we received about the cost of actually building ADUs, and that by taking away the ability for property owners to use them as short-term rentals, we're just not going to end up getting any ADUs because of the cost. And that, you know, they're very flexible housing types, right? Meaning 1 week they can be short-term rentals, next week they can be a long-term rental, right? So there's also a lot of data from the West Coast where the percentage of ADUs used as short-term rentals is less than 10% on average. Most are long-term rentals, you know.
I hear what you're saying. I just see, I mean, we're putting a 1% cap on the short-term rentals. There's probably more in the city that wants to be short-term rentals. And then we're using a tool that we want to do for more housing. And I don't know, it sits uncomfortably with me. I don't know if Rennie, Michael, you have anything to add, or Sue, to that, but I would really like to see that gone, personally.
A 1% cap, can you give us a sense of how many units that actually,
It's about 100.
about 100?
Yeah, 100, 106 to be specific.
How many, do you know how many we have now? How many?
Over 200.
So in essence, what we'd actually be doing at 1% is reducing the current number by 50%, which
That's right.
would be opening up more units for long-term rental.
Yes.
That is kind of to my point, then if we have ADUs, and I guess, I don't know,
Right. I think in what's going to happen is that we're going to hit the cap quite soon, and then it's
Bartek, though, I think, didn't
then,
you?
so when somebody comes and say, I want to build an ADU, and the city is at the 1%, then you would just be very transparent, or whoever, I guess it'd be building safety, or is it planning, would be very transparent, like you can't use this as
Cap
a
has been
short-term
removed.
rental, the
Yep.
cap is full?
yes.
I had in my notes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I had the 100 units, but I had that we only have about 50 right now that are registered. So the 300, that would mean that there's 250 out there that are just operating without being actually legalized okay.
That's right.
What is that the data that's coming also back from the county on how many units are registered with the county?
That's, I think you got that from building safety, correct?
Right. What I've learned is that because the county does collect taxes, but Airbnb has changed the way they're collecting that. So they collect it on behalf of the owners. So the county, last I spoke to the finance commissioner, the county doesn't have the specific list of addresses that's up to date. Is the last information I received.
Because the council a few years ago, I think before you were here, we did an intermunicipal agreement to get that data from them. So.
And I do have that list, which actually was very helpful in regards to the current regulations because it indicates who is actually operating before that July 15th, 2021 cutoff date.
So could I ask about the process then of applying for the permits? How will that, is there already a process in place for that, or is it going to be like those old movies of the opening up the West and the wagons?
We are speaking to Steve Knox about this today. So all registration is going to happen online via GovOS. So it's going to be a little bit easier. If there's demand above the 1% cap, there will be a waiting list. Should there be, but we still have to, as we get closer to this passage, I think the building safety and I would sit down and determine what to do at the onset if there is a sudden rush and prepare for that scenario.
So there wouldn't be any preference given to people who've already registered and who followed all the rules?
Yeah, if you're already registered, then you automatically count towards the 1% cap. Absolutely, yep. Yeah, no, we'll be rewarding those who follow the rules.
I'm just back to the short-term rental and the ADUs. I just feel like because ADUs are going to be so brand new, and then if we were to just ban short-term rentals outright, there's just no ambiguity about it and no confusion around it. And
Ban the short-term rentals on the ADUs?
yes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Fine with giving property owners a little flexibility there.
We should at least, are you keeping notes?
Yeah, I think-
Maybe put this on the list, because I'd like, there's only 4 of us, so
Yeah.
that would be a good,
I think this,
talking point to
yep.
bring back up.
Okay.
Maybe that one we just do arm wrestling over. Thumb wrestling.
I mean, I play pianos, don't mess with my thumbs.
I play ukulele. I can match your thumb.
I just want to keep going back to the fact that we have, and not even like the official housing crisis that, is the law that we passed, right? But just that, like, we were just down units, right? So again, like, just always keeping that in mind.
Anything? No thoughts?
That's a,
He's cataloging all the Bob Dylan songs he's heard.
Then? Do you have anything else? I mean, that was what we were going to talk about tonight, so if there's no more questions, or anybody wants to have any more
Well, I have
conversation.
a question on a different issue.
Okay.
So you and I met and we were talking about the transects and the number of units that could be put on a property and that kind of thing. And you very nicely laid out the limitations. I saw 1 or 2 here. So I'm wondering if you have some place where you've got a clear list of those limitations, because the 2 things, that I've been hearing are people who are concerned with the fear that somehow, 12-story apartment buildings are going to be built across from their houses. The other one has to do with, it's not so much in Ward 3, but the issue of parking. And I just think that we don't need to have mandatory minimums. I think those actually undermine a lot of the key issues that we're trying to get at. So, and that's a different topic altogether, but.
Right. So exactly, this is a form-based code, right? When the city hired Dover Cole, one of the key recommendations of the zoning task force was to do a form-based code, exactly because we can more carefully regulate the form of buildings. So we're doing that via building heights. We're doing that via setbacks. We're doing that via maximums on square footage for any particular building. We're doing that via lot coverage, right? So you can only build upon a certain percentage of any particular lot. And as you go from the most urban to the most rural areas of the city, that lot coverage lot coverage maximum drops from 100% right to down to as low as 25% or 30%. So what that means is, all of the if you walk down any street, the form-based requirements do a pretty good job of reflecting back to you what you're already seeing in terms of how big the buildings are, how tall they are, how they interact with the street. All these things are considered in the form-based standards. And then we did have a parking discussion of our first deep dive. And I have proposed some changes to the parking standards to Andrea, and she has given me some feedback on that that I will take before I present that to the whole council. Is that accurate? Okay.
Like I said, if you have a specific list, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions that I could put together for Steve that you guys might have? I have my,
I suppose the other one has to do with commercial establishments, because it's the other. Their mind is the worst possible outcome.
is that a bad thing? I mean, I feel it, I don't know. To be able to get something real quick.
Right.
Well, the irony is that the people who are saying this live just within a few blocks of Terry's, which is exactly what this is. But no, I mean, their concern is that, you know, different kinds of commercial establishments will be put into their urban, residential, what are now residential neighborhoods. And, you know, and then you're going to have like neon lights and you're going to have all these things. And so, I mean, a lot of this, of course, is the form requirements would reduce that, but there's still the issue.
There's signage standards, right? There's signage standards. There's standards for operating hours specifically for corner stores. Yeah, I don't think that the economics would support a corner store on every block. But what we do see, right, historically is that each neighborhood used to have its corner store that's walkable to most residents, providing some level of services. I don't think we can necessarily go back to that because the economics have changed, but at least here we're opening up that possibility. Yeah.
As just somebody who, when I bought my current house, there was nothing. And now you have Village Refinery, you have Kingston Standard. So it's like, you know, it's really great and all my neighbors really like it. So I think it's just one of those, I know you're not arguing for that, but I think it's one of those, you know, change seems scary, but I forgot the quote that you used last time. But, you know, it is actually really nice. It's a little expensive for me. You can't afford it right now, but it is really nice if I need a potato, I just have Ed run out to the corner store, so.
We're at the butcher shop.
Well, I'm vegan,
Yeah.
so, but yeah, I mean, well, that was a bakery before, but yeah, you have the butcher shop, you have the bake shop, it's
Been
just,
great. The
yeah,
exp-
it's
yeah, the
super,
expansion of a walkable neighborhood and the,
yeah.
that we have access to, or
Yeah, because in Ward 9, it really has
there was
changed
nothing. Yeah,
quite a
there was
bit.
Walgreens.
And everybody likes it. I don't know if you hear the same thing, I just hear it on my block.
I
but
know.
yeah.
it's-
More corner stores.
Yes.
That in the requirements.
I have a question. Bartek, would there ever be the city having a possible like master list for applying for an apartment that has an affordability factor, or, you know, to vet the people so that it's consistent throughout all of the city and the buildings and
Yeah. We've definitely discussed it internally. New York City does have kind of like a portal for that. I think it's a matter of capacity. I'm not sure I'm ready for zoning code, but I think it is a possibility. Yeah.
so our planning board has one more meeting, is that?
Yeah, the planning board has had 3 sessions so far. They've gone through every section of the new code. Their next session is March 30th, and that's kind of a wrap-up, circle back type session. I've asked board members to provide us with what their top 5 issues might be with the code. My goal is to have at that session assemble, a list of all of the comments and alternatives, and then have that list available for them to just review and think about maybe for another week, and then they'll have a special meeting at which they'll make the recommendation.
I guess that
Okay,
is it.
So
if a-
the one, just to do a short recap, if you don't mind. So the one issue that there's some debate on, ADUs at short-term rentals. And then Rennie, I will get you that list of standards.
If any more questions pop up, please reach out to us and we can gather them and get more information. I mean, I say we, but it's mostly Bortec, thank you. And then our next one, obviously we'll have to, I haven't rescheduled it yet, but that will be the enforcement. So I think that's gonna be a big one too, because putting this in place, we gotta make sure it's gonna work. So thank you for being here. Sue Cahill, thank you for your time. Elisa, thank you for your time. And I will be in touch about the third session, and I'll reach out to Steve and ask that
Okay,
question.
great. Thank you.
I'll actually see if he can make the
be
enforcement one.
great.
I think that would be important for him to be there.
Are you looking at dates for the next one? Have you?
I have not yet, but it's on my to-do list to do it.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want, I will make that happen in the next couple days.
Okay, all right. I was just curious. I'm looking at.
Thanks, Elisa.